Shell PLC, and has also had stints with BP, American Incorporated, Lehman Brothers, HSBC Holdings, and Drexel. Quite a number of hosts, and currently runs her own consultancy as well. And on my immediate left, we have Patrick Jeffson. Patrick Jeffson, born, raised in Ireland, and has a master's degree in political science. Has, at a point, was with the Princess of Wales, Princess Diana, as her PR.
No, chief of staff.
Chief of staff. Technically chief of staff. Ghana, we also do have a chief of staff, probably because of the Commonwealth. And then also currently runs PR. To start with, what is the purpose for coming to Ghana? We hear you're in Ghana for a conference.
Yes, we gave speeches yesterday at a conference called the P World,
okay,
which is a series of conferences all over the world, from the Middle East to Central Europe to now Africa, our first African conference. And it is to help encourage and educate PR professionals and practitioners, marketing professionals and practitioners, and there's also a P World conference for human resources practitioners.
Oh.
But we participate in the public relations and the marketing conferences.
And well, Patrick, what would you say has been the public relations like? Has it improved in the last, say, 10 years?
Well, you know, Martin, it's an evolving profession. I think one of the lovely things that we find going around the world talking at these conferences is that there's an enormous enthusiasm for good practice in the profession. We all know that there's a lot of very bad examples not to follow. What we hope is that we are able to pass on some of our experience about how to do it properly. It doesn't mean that we're experts, it means that we learned our lessons doing the job, sometimes the hard way.
Okay, and that brings to mind the handling of information, and like you mentioned, there have been some bad examples that should not be followed. What makes a good public, let me just say, what makes a good PR?
Well, I always found the way to keep things simple in public relations is to keep them truthful. To be honest. I think the bad examples tend to come from people who think they're very clever. They're also usually the ones who charge the most money. They will promise the earth to their clients. They will say, everybody hates you, we will make them love you. Your newspaper headlines are bad, we will make them good. And of course, it's a human instinct. You want that, don't you? Especially if you have lots of money. But usually those PR practitioners are the kind who are here one day and they're gone the next. And when they go, they'll take your money with them, and they'll go on and perhaps create trouble somewhere else.
You mentioned two words, truthfulness and honesty. Is that what we really do get from especially high-level people?
The good ones, yes.
How do you define something that is truthful? When there's certainly, and I'll be coming to the American example shortly, just giving a few. There are times when there is already information in the public space, and there is some level of certainty because maybe those that are spreading the information are either eyewitnesses or people who have experienced whatever we are talking about. But government or people in high office would want to manage the information. That raises questions about the truthfulness and the honesty of it, doesn't it?
Well, I think perhaps the best guideline for those who are advising those in public life is that you don't have to tell the whole truth, but what you do say has to be reliable. And as a PR professional, you have to make sure that your boss does not incriminate him or herself, that you have to know the limit to which it's sensible to go or necessary to go, but never ever to misrepresent the truth, particularly if it is authenticated from other sources.
Okay, Barry Joe, you have dealt with President W.H. Bush. You've dealt with former President Ronald Reagan. How sensitive is it when it comes to giving out information surrounding the offices of these people?
Well, of course, there is a great deal of national security information and market-sensitive information that you have to be very, very careful the timing of the disclosure, the nature of the disclosure, and the issue of what is full disclosure. And sometimes the only thing that you can say, and this is also true in corporate life and representing corporate clients, is, I'm awfully sorry, but I can't comment on that at this time. So you give the information that you're able to give at the time that you're able to give it, but you also have to have a really good poker face. You know, there's no tells up here that says, ooh, this may not be everything. And as Patrick said, you have to be truthful. I have never knowingly was dishonest on behalf of any client or any officer I was representing, whether it was a president or a chief executive officer in corporate life, because your own integrity must be preserved as well.
Do you learn these in terms of how much information to give at what point in time?
Well, you usually, I mean, you're not alone. There are usually teams of other advisors, legal advisors, and others around the table, and you have a strategy, and you stick to the strategy, and sometimes you have to modify the strategy a little bit if there's a leak. And then you have to have a discussion around what you can respond to and what you can't, and there are always very good reasons when you cannot respond.
And when a lot of these issues come up, when you need to tell the public something and you know that it is not the entire truth, have you ever felt like we are doing something that is not entirely right?
Touch wood, I have not had that problem.
Okay. The two key things surrounding the name Princess Diana would be her external relationship and then also her passing. Talking about, I mean, she's had lots of humanitarian activities globally, and I think that she's been commended quite greatly for that. But let's talk about how the Buckingham Palace and your office, for that matter, handled stories and news and rumors at first about her relationship with someone who was not from the royal family. How did that happen, and how did you strategize to manage the news?
Well, it was a sad reality of my 8 years there that much of it coincided with the breakdown of the marriage of Prince Charles and Princess Diana. My priority in that case was to make sure that her important work on behalf of so many charitable organizations, and indeed on behalf of the country, was able to proceed as smoothly as possible. Not least because it was in her work that she found so much personal satisfaction. That gave her happiness. And the better she did her job, then the happier I was, and it felt to me that the better that was for the whole institution of the monarchy. As for her private life, it's always unwise to get involved in other people's marital problems. But what I was very conscious of was that the problem was created not just by her, that she was not necessarily the most sinning party, and indeed, to quote from one of the newspapers at the time, that she was perhaps more sinned against than sinning.
And did it hurt her services, the other side of the good she was doing? Do you think this hurt her in any way?
Well, and you know, surprisingly, Martin, I think perhaps the opposite was true, because ordinary people saw in her life and in her experience many reflections of their own. You know, there was this image that royalty was kind of above the rest of humanity. But in Princess Diana and in the way she handled her problems in her private life, the challenges she had in the role she was given in public life, many people, particularly those who themselves had trouble in their lives, were able to identify with her. And that gave her enormous sympathy, which continues to this day.
We would now be focusing on maybe the day of the accident and the way the world received it and all of that. We'll come to that. But let me turn my attention again to Mary Jo. Mary Jo, at a point in time, you would want to be careful, like you mentioned, what kind of information you give and the amount of information you give out. When you have corporate institutions, for instance, those that deal in oil production, and they have a major disaster, how much of a weight is it for the communication team of these companies or the consultancy or the consultants that work with them?
It's a tremendous weight because you have a serious incident that may have involved a loss of life, that may be involving an ongoing environmental issue that you have to manage. The world's media are paying attention. The shareholders, the other kinds of stakeholders, NGOs, governments, of course, are paying a great deal of attention. So it is a tremendous issue to manage, and it unfolds in real time, like news. It is news, and it's 24/7. So it is a very challenging environment in which to work.
And has the media ever been a threat? Looking at the fact that this is the amount of information we are willing to give out as a company, as an institution, and this is also by way of giving advice. If this is the amount of information an institution, an individual wishes to give out, and the media is digging and is digging, do they at a point look like they are a threat?
Well, it's certainly frightening, and one can feel threatened. But I think it's helpful for, whether it's the chief executive of the company or the spokespeople for the company, they need to keep in mind that the media have a job to do. And their job is not the same as the corporate representative's job. The corporate representatives have a lot of interests to balance. The news media have a lot of interests to balance, but those interests don't necessarily coincide. So it's helpful to keep in mind, and I would also ask that news representatives keep in mind that there are jobs to be done on both sides. The goal is to get the information out, to get it out as fully as possible, as quickly as possible, but sometimes the timetables don't merge.
Yeah, and should it always ever have that that compromised position or common ground? Because, for instance, as a media house, we have credible information from some activity, and we have asked the side of an institution, the company, the individual, give us your side so we can put out a balanced report. In that process, do you think we can say, let's find a common ground, or ours is to just report it as it is?
I think it would be helpful if we could have that conversation about the common ground and understand that we're not enemies. We just have different objectives in the moment, but the same objective over time. But of course, you work to a different deadline than a corporate person might have a much longer time frame in which to manage. And so you can't always get there. But I've always had to remind myself they are not the enemy. They just have a different job.
Is public relations difficult?
Yes.
It is difficult.
And the best public relations practitioners make it seem easy.
Okay.
But it is not easy. It's like the swan on the water and those little webbed feet paddling.
Okay, now let's come back to Patrick. You see, the accident of Princess Diana hit the world badly. I remember I was in church that morning when my pastor mentioned it. I was taken out because I really liked Princess Diana. How were you with her at the time?
No, I actually resigned from working for Princess Diana a year before she died.
Oh.
So my life had moved on, but nevertheless, like you, when I heard the news, I think none of us will forget where we were at the time. And I was immediately aware that we had lost somebody irreplaceable. I mean, for me, it was the loss of somebody who I knew well and admired. But I also could see in a historical context that now here was another historical figure who was no longer with us, but whose memory needed to be preserved and honored, and the lessons that she had perhaps so painfully learned could be recognized and followed by others who came after her.
What usually happens when there is a major issue like that? Do you what we see, normally people take into reality what we see in movies. So maybe a high profile person, there's a problem, then immediately the national security rushes in to cover up and then try to move them away. When is that what happens in real life when you're working with some of these high profile people? And I'll throw the same question to you.
I mean, there are plans, contingency plans for these sorts of things. You know yourself in broadcasting, you have a library of obituary material ready to put out on people who you think might be taken from us at any minute. I think in the case of Princess Diana, it was a surprise. Obviously, she was not expected to die. There were many older members of the royal family who might have expected to die before her, and the contingency plans quite naturally focused on those. But the planners are very good, and it was possible to modify one of those plans in very short time to produce an appropriate funeral service and a chance for not just the people in Britain, but, as you say, people around the world to express their own grief.
Okay. And talking about U.S. presidency, we know that its level of security has been spoken about quite widely. How quick is the response team and information about an issue when it happens?
You try to be as quick as possible, as immediate as the situation demands. And again, as Patrick said, you have plans. Obviously, an event doesn't necessarily evolve the way you planned for it.
Okay.
But it's helpful. It's also helpful in corporate life to have gone through the plan, to understand the roles of the various individuals who will be involved, and to operate that plan. As it won't necessarily be the way you rehearsed it, but having had that rehearsal, you're just that little bit more calm in the circumstance.
And does that translate into corporate life? There's a company, should you have, I mean, you have a general public relations policy, but about the passing of individuals, an emergency, should there be policies surrounding all of these?
Absolutely. Every corporation, big or small, even a single person company, should have a plan in place for the various things that can go wrong.
Okay.
So that when those things go wrong, and eventually they all seem to, and sometimes they all do it at the same time, you're ready. And you have that little bit more confidence that the plan gives you as the situation unfolds.
Fortunately or unfortunately, there seemed to be a lot more attention on the negativities of, stories around institutions, individuals, I mean, in public life. How much good is there when it comes to these? And then, are those good stories also given much attention as the bad?
Well, unfortunately, the good stories don't seem to get as much media attention as the bad stories do. But there's a lot of good news out there. And it's very important to put it out. The good news of successes in a company, successes for a government. Sadly, bad news sells more newspapers and more advertising time than good news, but it's very important to put it out there and to keep building relationships with those who cover the company or the government to have a place to go when you have good news. So, Martin, we're going to announce this today. We wanted you to be the first to know, give you the background, and there is a tremendous amount of what's called backgrounding that goes on that sets the stage for the good news as well as the bad news.
Okay.
And just add to that, Martin, if I may. Very often, to get a good news story out, you need a very, very good picture. A photograph really does tell. It's better than 1,000 words. And certainly working with somebody like Princess Diana, a good photograph overcomes any language barriers and immediately gives the impression in people's minds that more than a story of several newspaper pages, one photograph will do the job. And a lot of organizations fail to understand the importance of the photograph. Organizations also fail to understand that the general public are not stupid, and if there is a sudden rush of good news stories, you immediately wonder, what are they hiding?
Yeah,
so
people raise questions.
it comes back to the honesty issue. It has to be in context, and it has to be very much not covering up bad news.
Have you ever had to take that kind of decision where you must, we will put it as kill a story?
Well, it is. It's part of the process that Mary Jo is describing. Your relations with the media. Now, I have not personally, but I have seen it in action, and it's usually quite unattractive. What happens is the organization enters into a kind of trading deal with the media organization. We will give you this maybe privileged information in return for you suppressing that information. That is never a good way to carry on in the long term. So it does come back to this issue of authenticity, of credibility, honesty, and respecting your audience. People are not stupid, people are well informed, and they will smell a rat if you are not being straight with them.
Yeah, and it brings to mind the part of what we have already mentioned, your relationship with the media. There are those who have misinterpreted that to mean that you are buying the media, or you are owning the media. The media is in your pocket. So whenever there is something bad about you, there is a way you can influence the media, not to tell it the way it is, but to tell it not to damage your corporate, your institution, or the individual that much. Is that the same from where you have worked and people you've dealt with?
I have often wished that that were the case, but it is not the case, unfortunately. But what you can do, if you have good relationships with the news organizations that cover you, is get yourself a little bit of time. But that's the most I've ever been able to get. I've never tried to kill a story.
To hold on to
to ask, look, I'm trying to help you, but I need some time to get the information that you're asking for. So can you give me a break here? But that's pretty much the best I've ever been able to do.
And when the media keeps knocking at your door and calling your phones and all of that, what's the immediate thing to do?
Well, it's like we were saying earlier, you have to have a plan.
Okay.
And in my experience, usually the most unwelcome calls come at the most unwelcome moment. Very often late on a Saturday night, for example. And quite soon you know what the deadlines for the newspapers are, because they will phone you right before deadline. And you have to be prepared for some very difficult questions. Sometimes they will present the question in a way that makes it very difficult to answer, that is designed to put you off balance. That's really when you earn your money.
Is public relations a difficult subject to handle?
It is, because you're dealing with a lot of competing interests, and you're.
But it's very important as well, isn't
It is. It is important, and sometimes it involves lives, actual lives on the line. So you have to have a cool head. You have to know when to keep your mouth shut, and it is far preferable for you to look stupid or uninformed than to give out the wrong information or too much information before it's appropriate.
Because of the backgrounds both of you have, some of the questions might seem to keep going back there.
Certainly.
It was under the administration of former President George Bush that America had to go to Iraq. What were the considerations? You probably may not be in the head of the president, but what were the considerations in deciding to go to Iraq? And then also, do you genuinely believe that the American-Iraq relationship was handled well?
I think in that circumstance, with President George H.W. Bush, the first Gulf War, if you will, I was not working for the president at the time, but I did go back into his administration later on, and the president was very forthcoming about what the mission was, the coalition that he built to achieve that mission, which was a very large, very diverse coalition, including others in the region who were very active. It was a very specific mission to liberate Kuwait from an Iraqi invasion. That was the limit of the mission, and that's what the mission accomplished. There was a fair amount of criticism in certain circles of the president for not, quote-unquote, finishing the job. And his position was very clearly articulated. We knew what the job was, we did the job, we finished the job, and when the job was complete, we left. And subsequent to his leaving office, he was a bit more forthcoming because he could be. about the nature of the coalition and what the job was and why we stopped when we stopped.
How difficult is the role of a leader, or how much of an impact is the role of a leader on the public communication of his activities or activities of his administration?
Well, I mean, particularly when you work for a president, it's the president who was elected, not you.
Okay.
You are fortunate that he chose you for the positions you've held, but it is he who is accountable. And it is on his behalf, or her behalf, when we have a woman president someday, that you act. I found it very helpful to have in President Reagan a president who had a very clear vision, who was very clear in articulating that vision. So it gave us, as his spokespeople and his representatives, the parameters within which to operate. And in any kind of leadership role, that is the greatest gift a leader can give to his or her staff, is that clarity.
Okay. You mentioned that there's a possibility of a first American female president. Maybe you're rooting for Hillary, is that it?
Well, as you can see from my biography, I'm a Republican at heart.
Oh.
And so I would like there to be a woman president, but not this woman.
Okay. All right, so just in conclusion, if you are to advise an individual, a corporate institution, or a government for that matter, you have worked in different spheres, what would your primary words be in terms of how they relate to the public and the media?
I think it's as simple as this, Martin, that the organization, like an individual, has to be comfortable with the truth. The real problems start when the truth is manipulated or suppressed or spun. Never ever spin.
Never ever spin. Okay, same question to you, Mary Jo.
Never lie. Never, ever lie. Because if
But
you're going
lie is relative, isn't it?
No, lying is very clear. An individual knows
If it's
where
blue and you say
where the
it's-
truth ends, and if you lie, you have to have a very good memory. I don't have a good memory, so I've always chosen
So it's
the
more
path of-
difficult to lie than to tell the truth.
I think it is much more difficult because you have to remember, and you have to remember for a long time. I've been in this business for a long time, and in the old days, news organizations had to go to the library and dig up microfiche to get old facts. Today, it's just a few words in a search engine, and it all comes up. So unless you have a really good memory, it's much better to stick to the truth.
And in most of these cases, we've had just half truth, not the entire.
Well, sometimes you can't tell everything at once.
So you need to drop it in.
So you
little
need to
pieces.
know, you need to have good judgment as well.
Okay. I've had a good time. I'd want to say a big thank you to you for educating us on, public relations and public communication. I've been speaking with Mary Jo Jacoby. She has worked extensively with, if I start mentioning, I'm sure we'll not leave here today. But then at least the very primary ones that you can remember is that at a point in time she has worked in both public and private sectors, including positions in administration of former President George H.W. Bush, and then also former President Ronald Reagan, and currently runs a number of institutions where she handles or helps people, individuals, and companies with their public communication. Thank you very much
Thank you,
for
Martin.
joining us. And then also Patrick Jeffson. One time, or a point in time, he was the chief of staff of Princess Diana, the world's most beloved. May she rest in peace. And then also currently runs a public relations and consultancy firm in Washington, D.C. So anytime you're there, you need any services, maybe they could pop. I hope your charges aren't too high.
Be delighted.
Okay. All right. So thank you very much. They were in Ghana for a public relations conference, and it started yesterday. It's ending today, and I'm sure those of you who know about it would want to pop by. But that will be it for this segment. So there is more to come on NewDay.